I'll direct your thoughts this evening to Esther chapter 4, the chapter that we read in specifically verses 13 and 14, but really the whole conversation that Mordecai has with Esther. We'll read verses 13 and 14, and before we read, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to come this evening. I remember coming to the coppice for my whole childhood, really, as a young child coming here for the Christmas service, and it's always been a special time. I remember being a young child, sometimes even sitting on the front pew, eagerly awaiting my book that I would be given. And so thank you very much for the kindness that you show, especially at Christmas, but also the kindness that you've shown to me today. Let's read Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Verse 13, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" For such a time as this. What is your purpose in this life? What is your purpose? If there's just one thought, one question, one thing that I want you to take away from this evening, if you forget everything else, I want you to think about this question. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? The book of Esther is actually quite a fascinating book. Within this book, there is actually no mention of God whatsoever, the name of the Lord at all. And yet he's found in every single event, in every single chapter of this little book. Esther's unique in one sense because it makes one slight passing reference to the land of Israel, the nation of Israel. Apart from that, it makes no reference to the land of Israel at all compared to all the other the books of the Old Testament. You think Genesis, there Abraham was commanded to go to the promised land, the land of Canaan, and there he was told by God that the generations that proceed from him would live there in the promised land. You think of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's all about how the Israelites make their way from Egypt to the promised land, this land of Israel where they will live. And then you look at Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, and it's detailing the history of the land of Israel, how the Israelites dwell there, their issues. We read there of course of their ultimate rebellion to God and how they're taken into captivity. You might think perhaps Daniel is another book where Israel is not really mentioned that much, but there we read at the start of Daniel how Daniel was taken from the land of Israel. And also we read later on in Daniel, don't we, the prayers of Daniel for the people to return to the land of Israel after those many years in captivity. But Esther almost makes no mention of the land of Israel, apart from a passing note there in chapter 2, where it says that Mordecai had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity. That's the only mention of the land of Israel. And so it's unique in the fact that it's set in an entirely different area. It's also a little bit random, this book, humanly speaking. It begins randomly. We begin with this celebration that King Ahasuerus makes, this emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. And he makes this feast, and it abruptly almost brings us to this scene where Ahasuerus is having these festivities, this celebration, and there he calls for his wife Vashti to come, and she refuses to come to be paraded in front of the people. And then we read, after that, the scene moves on. Ahasuerus is sad and he would like another wife. And we read about the selection process, and we see there Esther, this Jew who is an orphan, and there she's raised to become the queen of this empire, the wife of King Ahasuerus. And then abruptly again, at the end of that selection process where Esther is made queen, we see a conspiracy take place. And we see there how Mordecai finds out that two of the king's chamberlains have plotted to kill King Ahasuerus, and how Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the conspiracy fails. And then abruptly we learn about this man called Haman. He almost appears out of the middle of nowhere. Haman, this Amalekite, an enemy of the children of Israel, an enemy of the Jews, and how he is raised up to power to be second to King Ahasuerus alone, and how he dislikes Mordecai because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, and how Haman, he isn't just happy to kill Mordecai, he wants to kill every single Jew in the empire, and how he plots to make that take place, and he writes a law, an edict, so that the Jews will be destroyed on a particular day. And then we come to this conversation between Mordecai and Esther, and that's where we are in chapter 4. But although it's random, and it feels random, there's a sovereign thread that's running through every single one of these scenes, isn't there? We don't see it as random, do we? Because we see one overruling theme, and that's God's providence, divine providence that is running through this. We see God sovereignly working through all these actions and through all these events. What do we mean by God's providence? Well, we mean that God created this world, and God didn't just create this world and sit back and allow creation to do as it willed. God sovereignly ordains every single minuscule minor event that takes place in this world. God is entirely in control, and God moves slowly but surely for his own specific purpose. Everything that happens on God's say-so. And we see so many times, don't we, in Scripture, how men with their evil intentions, God overrules it for good. We think of someone like Joseph, don't we? How his brothers evilly sold him into slavery because of their jealousy, and then they lied to their father. But God sovereignly overrules those events so that Joseph is in the right place at the right time to deliver his family from famine. God is in control. Think of it like a painter. Perhaps you have gone on holiday and you see a painter as he's painting perhaps a scene of the coast. And every single brushstroke is a clear canvas. And we see the first brushstroke go on, and it doesn't really appear to make sense. But as the brushstrokes go on, slowly the picture's built up. And then you get to the final brushstroke, and it all makes sense. That's God's providence. He's working in ways that almost seem unrelated to us. But when we look back, we can see this beautiful masterpiece, God's providence, how he has overruled all these things for good. But I wonder, are we aware of God, of divine providence in our own lives? Do we see how God leads us? Do we see and appreciate God's providence in all the minor events that take place in our life? When we read Esther, we see obviously how she was raised up to be queen for a divine purpose. But do we see that in our own lives? Oftentimes, isn't it, we live in such a way that it's almost like God's not in control, and that he's not causing events to take place in our life. And oftentimes we don't live in a way in which we're aware of God's providence. I have 5 points that I want to bring to you this evening. And don't worry, some points are shorter than others. So if you feel like I'm dwelling on point 1, don't worry, I'm sure the other points will be quicker. The first point is this. From this chapter, from this conversation that we have, the first point that I'd like to make is that great advantages are given by God for a divine purpose. Great advantages are given by God for a divine purpose. We've already mentioned how Esther, she was an orphan. She'd lost her mother and father in childhood, and she was raised by her cousin Mordecai. And this almost ignoble background, this young girl, this teenage girl perhaps, who was a nobody in the province, in the land, who lived in Shushan, this city, she becomes queen. And when she becomes queen, certain advantages are conferred upon her, aren't they? As a queen of an empire, she had access to the king. She had access to King Ahasuerus unlike nobody else. She had influence. She could influence the king in a way that could change the laws, could change policy. And she had that because she was queen. She had the ear of the king, didn't she? She had the ear of the king. The king loved her. And so this great advantage that she's raised up provided her with such access to the king. And we can see the purpose as to why she was raised to become queen. And she was raised to that advantage. But what about us? God has also given us advantages, great advantages that are given to us by God. Let's just perhaps consider a few. We are here in the Black Country. We are here in the land of England. We all belong to Great Britain. And God has given us advantages because we live in the place that we live here in the UK. We have freedoms that other Christians do not have because they live in other places. We have freedoms to be able to speak about the things of God in public arenas. We still have the freedom to go out into the open air and proclaim God with relatively little persecution. We have freedoms because we belong in Britain. We have freedoms so that we can go out and we can bring children into Sunday school still, and we can teach them about the Bible. We have freedoms to evangelize, to bring people to bring people the gospel message. There are countries in this world that it's illegal to do that very thing, and yet God has given us this great advantage to be able to share the gospel with others. I think of Malaysia. I was there maybe 8 years ago, and one thing I realised when I was there for a few weeks, that Malaysians are born legally Muslim. And so it's illegal to seek to convert a Muslim to Christianity. And in fact, a pastor there spent many years in jail being accused of that very thing, of seeking to evangelize to a Malaysian man or woman, I don't know who it was, and he was accused of doing that illegal practice. You see, we have such freedoms here in the UK. We also have the benefit and advantage of technology, don't we, because we live here. And we can think of the advantages that gave us, even just a few years ago during the COVID pandemic, how we were so quickly able to change from meeting in person to virtual meetings. And what a blessing that was. 100, 200 years ago, they wouldn't have had, 50 years ago, they wouldn't have had the blessings, the advantages of technology that we enjoyed in that time, so that actually those years of pandemic, which could have been, which were so difficult, but could have been so much more difficult, God gave us the advantage of technology. Next, perhaps as we move away from Britain, we look to the church, and what advantage God has given us, placing us in a church. We can gather week by week with like-minded believers for mutual fellowship, for mutual encouragement. Being a Christian is so difficult, isn't it? Traversing through the world is tough, and God doesn't promise that it's going to be easy. He says, in this world ye will have tribulation, but week by week we can gather together for mutual benefit, to encourage one another. What a wonderful advantage that God has given us. And likewise, we get to hear the scripture. We get to sit under the sound of the gospel. There are so many Christians, perhaps in countries where it's illegal to gather together, who would just desire to hear one biblical message, and they can't. But we have that advantage given to us. But let's move personally. What advantages has God given to you personally? Think of all the talents, all the influence that God has given you. I wonder, if we just look at talents, I wonder if there's someone here who God has given the talent of being sociable. You know, that person who seems to be able to strike up a conversation with absolutely everyone, who can talk to anyone about everything, who's incredibly sociable, and they seem to be able to weave in something about the Lord in a conversation to the most unlikely of people. That's a talent, a God-given, unique trait given to you. Perhaps there are some here who have the talent of organisation, and I'm pretty bad at organising my own calendar and my own life, but there are people there who find great pleasure in organising events, and they have this wonderful talent that God has given them in planning and organising, and they can use it for God's purpose. Perhaps there are some here who have the talent of eloquence. They seem to be able to break down complicated truths into very simple sentences so that even the most simple person can understand. You see, God has conferred upon each of us great talents. We're all unique here, and God has made us unique for a purpose. And we don't have time to think about how God has given us the advantages of so much wealth. He's given us position in life. He's given us influence. Each one of us has a sphere of influence, don't we? There are some here who people look up to. When they speak, they listen and they take note. And God has given that advantage to you. But we need to note that the advantages that are given to us are given by God. The first thing to say is that they're not ours. And so often we can fall into the trap to think that the advantages that God has given to us are ours, and we act like they're ours. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, we see what Paul writes to the Corinthian church about this very issue. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And he reads there in verse 7. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now, if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory as if thou hadst not received it? And what Paul's saying there is that everything is given to you as a gift by God. Why is it that you're acting like it's not a gift from God? Why is it that you're boasting about it? If I was to stand perhaps by a car, a very nice car that wasn't mine, you would think it's shameful if I was to act as like that car was my own when it was not my own. But why do we do the same thing with the advantages that are given by God? Likewise, our advantages are given by God for a reason. And I've already said Esther was raised up for a purpose. But what purpose are the advantages given to us in our lives? What purpose is it that God has given the advantages that we have? Is it for his honour and glory? Or do we use it for our own enjoyment and our own pleasure? That's number one then, that God gives great advantages for a divine purpose. Number two, God requires such advantages to be used faithfully for the promotion of his purposes. You see, God gives these things and he expects us to use it faithfully for him. God requires that we use these advantages faithfully for him. You see, we read there in verse 8, don't we, of this chapter that we read, Esther chapter 4, verse 8. We see here Mordecai speaking to Esther that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him and to make request before him for her people. You see, Esther was raised to this position of the queen, but now she had to use that position for the benefit of the Jews. She was called to be faithful with the advantages that God had given her. And there was a real sense, a real threat of danger for her. And we read her response in verse 11, that she tells Mordecai how this could lead to her very death. We read there that there is a law that no one could approach the king unless they were asked by the king to come. And so anyone who came spontaneously, anyone who came of their own volition to the king, if the king saw fit, he would have them killed. And this is no empty threat. We see a similar threat, a similar law, a silly law perhaps, a law that could not be repealed in the life of Daniel, don't we? And how Daniel had to face the lion's den. There was that decree that was made that no one would be able to pray unto anyone else but King Darius. And Daniel was there caught praying to the true and living God. And although Darius loved Daniel, he could do nothing to stop him going to the lion's den, because one thing that you need to know about the Medo-Persian Empire is when a law is set fast, when a law is put into practice, it cannot be repealed. So Esther was under the threat of death, but she was called to be faithful, even unto death. And what can we say about that in our own lives? Well, Esther was called to be queen for a purpose and to use that faithfully. It's no good having advantages if we're not going to use them for God's purpose. Think about this. Think about if you had enough money, perhaps enough advantage in your own life, that you were to build an orphanage in Africa, and you found a plot of land, you purchased it, and you got some local builders and you built a wonderful orphanage. It had rooms for 50 to 100 children, and you made sure that everything was there. The dormitories were perfect. You built the shower cubicles, and everything was perfect and ready. And then you never bothered actually moving an orphan into that orphanage. How useful would that be? It's a folly, it's foolish. And so God gives us advantages, expecting us to use them for his purpose. And note, whatever advantages that we have, it's not a concern. It's how we use them. It's the test is the faithful disposal of our advantages. We think of the time when the Lord Jesus Christ was here on this earth, and we see him there at the temple, and he's observing men and women putting money into the collection box. And he sees there grand men who come in, and you can hear them cast their money in, and you can hear the jangle of the donation box, because all of the amount of coins that they're giving. And then there's this old lady who comes, and she just gives two mites, and God looks to her, and he says, she is the one who is given the most. She is the one who is most faithful. The rest gave out of their abundance, but she gave all that she had. So it's not a concern about what advantages you have. It's about how you use them. We see here a common barrier given. If we read here in verse 13, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. And isn't this often a barrier for us that gets in the way of us of faithfully using that which God has given us? This barrier of self-preservation. Mordecai is saying here, don't think, Esther, that you will preserve yourself by being quiet, by retreating into the shadows, by keeping silent. And you can see here, there is that temptation, isn't there, in life, to protect ourselves rather than serving the interests of the Lord. You can think, perhaps Esther was thinking, maybe I'll just keep quiet this time. Maybe I won't say anything. And think, if I do and I end up dying because I open my mouth, then I can't do any good any further. If I just keep quiet here, then perhaps later on, if I pick my battles wisely, I can do a greater good for the Jews. And she perhaps might have thought that way, and perhaps we sometimes think about that way. We seek to pick our battles, but God calls us to be faithful soldiers. Think of an army in which soldiers are able to pick the battles that they will fight. That army would capitulate within moments, wouldn't it? God demands we use what we have faithfully. Perhaps I'll give you an example, a personal example of a man who used what God had given him faithfully in a small way, but in a remarkable way. You see, there was perhaps about 18 years ago, there was a man who was very unwell. He was very unwell. He was dying, and this man was in hospital. And a man who lived about an hour and a half away got into his car. So he gave his time up, we see there. He got into his car, and he went to visit that man in hospital. And there he came on multiple occasions and prayed with this dying man and encouraged him in scriptures. And then after that man died, the man who lived so very far away once again got into his car, and he went to the family, that large family of that man who had died. And there he sat with the family and encouraged them and strengthened them in prayer and in scripture, knowing full well that they didn't have a pastor themselves. He took that pastoral role, and that's none other than your own pastor recently departed. You see there David Field using faithfully what was given by him, the advantages given to him by God, for the greater good, for the good of God's kingdom. So there's point 2. We are to faithfully use what God has given us. Point 3, if we read on here, we see Mordecai says to Esther, don't think that you will escape. Verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. He's saying to Esther, look, if you hold your peace, it doesn't matter. God's purposes, God's providence will be that the Jews will be delivered from another place. And we read there our third point, that God's providence can never, ever be defeated, can never, ever be frustrated. Mordecai had such confidence in this. These are bold words. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Mordecai said these words in a time where there was no deliverance, no remedy really seen. There was a whole empire that stood against the Jews. And Mordecai, with great confidence, said, God is still going to work out a way, even if you don't use what you have, Esther. And isn't that just a wonderful thought? And we read here that God's purposes don't depend on humans. No human action, no human inaction can thwart the providence, the purposes of God. God does not depend on human agency. And that's a wonderful thought, isn't it? We think of the time Jehoshaphat was king, don't we? And there 3 armies came together up against Jerusalem. Humanly speaking, Jehoshaphat had no hope whatsoever. But what did God say? God said, you will not need to fight in this battle. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And oftentimes we read, don't we, in the history of Israel, how God seemingly goes out of the way and doesn't use humans at all to fulfill his purposes. He himself deals with the issue. God does not depend on human agency. God's will cannot be defeated. And think about that, oftentimes, isn't it? We focus so much on humans when we're in problems, and we look to humanistic solutions so quickly. We put our trust in our fellow men when we're in a pickle and when we're in troubles. But really, our trust should be in God and in his providence. But also know that God doesn't cast off human agency altogether. We can say confidently that God doesn't require humans to do that which is will. But isn't it pleasing to him to use for humans, even us, to do that which pleases and honours him for the promotion of his kingdom? Think about preachers. God uses preachers. The foolishness of preaching we read in the New Testament, don't we? For his honour and glory, to bring others, lost souls, to the gospel, to the Lord Jesus Christ. Think about how God uses mothers and fathers in the labour of love that it is raising children. And God blesses the faithful work of mothers and fathers as they seek to teach their children day in and day out, week in and week out, about the things of God. As they seek to be an example, God uses that. And that's a wonderful truth. Even deacons and those who hold office in the church, God uses them for his will. But think of this just personally for a moment. Providence cannot be defeated. God's divine purpose can never be thwarted. God's purpose in your life, in all the events that take place in your life, whether they be tragic, whether they be difficult and burdensome, they're all for a purpose of love. We read there in the New Testament, don't we? All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. What a humbling thought that is, isn't it? That all things work together. Every minute circumstance, every single event, perhaps events that will take place in this week that you will look at and go, why on earth has that happened to me? That's all part of God's divine purpose, and he is never out of control. If it be that perhaps someone else in this world is the cause of your problem, it's not that human that will be able to thwart God's divine purpose of love towards to you. I saw saw this morning, and I've seen it a few times. We live in a cul-de-sac, and we live right at the bottom of the cul-de-sac, and you can look up the street, and it's a little bit of an incline going down. And there's this man. He's an elderly man, and I think he's had a stroke. And I've seen him a few times about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, and he's tottering down this street, down this road, and it's an uneven road. The pavement isn't smooth, and he's almost stumbling and staggering from one side to the other. He's not using a walking aid or anything like that. And I've seen him a few times, and I've thought, it looks dangerous. He should be using a walking aid or something like that. But the miraculous thing is he's never fallen off the pavement. I've never seen him fall over, despite the fact that he looks so unsteady on his feet. And it's likewise in the Christian life, isn't it? So often in our life we feel unsteady, like we're jottering and tottering to and fro. We feel like we're almost about to make shipwreck, but God's purposes can never be thwarted. God's purpose of love to you can never be changed. Even your own self, even when you feel that you've fallen just one too many times, you've fallen into the same sin, the same temptation, and you think, this is it, I've made shipwreck of my faith. You cannot thwart, you cannot defeat God's purpose of love to you. What a wonderful thing that God's providence can never be defeated. God will provide enlargement and deliverance in another place if Esther was to remain quiet. But we carry on to our fourth point. And we read here that Mordecai, he says to Esther, if you hold your peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. Shall be destroyed. And our fourth point is this. Those who seek to frustrate God's providence may be injured in doing so. I don't think we can make a definitive truth of this from this one passage. But here, Mordecai is saying to Esther, if you don't use the advantages that God has given you, you will be destroyed. You and your father's house shall be destroyed. And although God is sovereign over all, what it does teach us is that our actions have consequence. And it's a solemn point that we make here. Our actions have consequence. And likewise, our inactions have consequence. Believers are not to neglect their duty, for it could cause injury to be bestowed upon them. Think of Jonah, for example. Jonah, who was called by the Lord into a very public service for him, the business of dealing with souls. And Jonah, he refuses to do that work. And although, once again, we see God sovereignly overruling all that takes place, Jonah himself does great injury to himself. He ends up 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, brought to such a low place. And likewise, if we are to neglect their duty, we need to be warned that it may cause us injury. It may cause us injury. It's a solemn point, but we have to make it, because here Mordecai calls on Esther to do her duty, and if not, that there would be injury. So we move on to point 5, our last point, which is this: a faithful performance of our duty reaps rich rewards. We see Esther here, and she faithfully performs that which Mordecai requests her to do, that which God had raised her up to do. And what do we see? We see a remarkable deliverance from the Jews in a way that's so great, it's beyond her capacity. It reminds me of the Queen of Sheba when she came to Solomon and she says, half of it hasn't been told me. And this is the same way that Esther finds deliverance. You see, Esther calls on Mordecai to declare a fast for 3 days, and then she bravely and courageously goes into King Ahasuerus, and King Ahasuerus holds out his scepter. And she requests that they come, her and Haman and King Ahasuerus have a dinner together, and there Haman and King Ahasuerus, Esther, together in this dinner, and she mysteriously perhaps loses her courage and confidence in asking for Ahasuerus, in asking for the Jews to King Ahasuerus. But even in that mysterious delay, we see something sovereignly working out. We see there that night after that dinner that King Ahasuerus and Haman had with Queen Esther, King Ahasuerus couldn't sleep. And so God even sovereignly overrules the sleep of the kings. And there, the King Ahasuerus, in his lack of sleep, he calls for the chronicles to be read to him. And perhaps he thought that was a perfect way to get off to sleep by listening to the chronicles. And there he reads of Mordecai, this man who spared his life, who was the means of God to save him from that conspiracy. And then the following day, Haman has to parade Mordecai around the city, saying, "This is what is done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And then he goes back to his house, and he's already built these gallows, these gallows for Mordecai to hang on. And as he's there and he's groaning because he's had to do something so great to Mordecai, the very person that he wanted to die, he's called back to the banquet with Esther and King Ahasuerus. And there Esther opens her heart to King Ahasuerus. And we see how Haman is destroyed in a moment. He hangs on the very gallows that he erected to slay Mordecai. And we see then how an edict is written in the hands of Mordecai that on that very day in which the Jews were to be destroyed, that instead the Jews would be gathered together to be able to fight off their enemies. And so it's not just deliverance that God provides for the Jews. He actually uses it to slaughter many of the enemies of the Jews. And on that day we read of hundreds of the Jews' enemies being removed and being done away with. And isn't it wonderful, the rich rewards that occur when Esther observed her duty? And it's the same with us. It's the same with us. It's the same with us when we do that which God has purpose for us to do. So in conclusion, what do I say? Well, what picture of divine providence, what picture is divine providence painting for us, for you? What work, what service, what purpose does God have for you? You see, you are here. In this place, God has sovereignly ordained everything about you, your characteristics, the family that you're set in, the place that you are, the time that you are in. And the question is, what work does God have for you to do? You see, there's no room for fatalism. That's one of the most interesting things. Mordecai is energized by divine providence. He's energized by the thought of God's sovereignty over this situation, and he calls out to Esther to work. And there Esther, God's sovereignty is no barrier to prayer. Esther, knowing that this is what the Lord had raised her up to do, she calls for a fast, she calls for days of prayer. And God's sovereignty, God's providence should energize us in his work. So I ask you the question that I answered, that I began this evening with. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? And we'll read these verses just through one last time. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Amen.
Thank Henry for his ministry here today, and may God add his blessing. If the Lord will,